Hello witches, and welcome to Activist Witch. What is the actual line? Where we discuss witchcraft and activism. My name is Raven, my pronouns are they, them, and in this video we're going to discuss the absolute cluster-up. That is the UK Supreme Court's ruling on what is a woman. No. There you go. Latch onto the face. That's it. Here's a good focus. But before we get started, let me remind you that Isha has opened a coffee, and if you like what we do here, you can support us directly there with a one-off donation, a monthly donation, or you can even get a tarot reading with her, Italian style. The low-income option starts at £5, so if you decide to support us there, thank you so very much. I don't even really know where to begin with this. I mean, the ruling and its 88 pages and paragraph after paragraph of interpretation of law is just so factually incorrect and against reality and decency and rationality. But we gotta start somewhere, so. For those of you who aren't in the know, I don't know how many of you there possibly are, but the UK Supreme Court has ruled in a judgment that was between anti-trans organisation for Women Scotland and Sex Matters against a bill put forward by the Scottish government back in, I don't even know at this point, like this stuff has been going on for so long. Essentially I don't even like this bill. Like, this bill is so stupid, it's just unbelievable. The bill that the Scottish government put forward was an attempt at an equality bill for boards of directors in companies, saying they needed to be at least 50% female and 50% male, and then also added in the provision that trans women, I think at least if they had a gender recognition certificate, would count as women in those diversity statistics. And I hate this bill. I mean, how many times do we need to go like, yay, more trans CEOs? Like, I don't want CEOs. I want to abolish the structure that leads to CEOs. I want to dismantle every hierarchy in society. And yet, because the Scottish government have decided to try to be inclusive with their fucking pyramid scheme that is capitalism, this is where we end up. And when this court case comes in, they don't even have the balls, excuse the phrase, to fight it properly. And now I have lost rights. I think the important background here is in the ways in which the Scottish government, in trying to be inclusive, has created a constitutional crisis, if we even had a constitution, in establishing legal friction between laws set out in Scotland and those that are set out in England and Wales, because Wales has to be lumped in with England. We don't even get our own courts. In a similar instance where the Scottish government actually did try to do something decent and inclusive, but without reinforcing these ridiculous structures that we all have to live under, they put forward a reformation to the Scottish Gender Recognition Act, which was, I believe, put in place in 2004 to syncretize with the English Gender Recognition Act. So, whereas it was syncretized between the two nations, in Scotland trying to reform the bill so that Scottish people would have more autonomy, more self-actualization, more control over their own legal status and destiny. That created a friction where, because the UK is this ridiculous conglomerate of legal systems and ideals that only really work so long as everyone agrees that it does. You had an instance where the UK government, Westminster, had to instruct the Crown not to give royal assent to the law, killing it dead, which was a constitutional crisis in itself. I mean, this is the amazing power that trans people have. Every time we come up, we risk destroying all of society. And personally, I think that's fantastic. I just wish it didn't have to come at such a ridiculous cost to everyone, essentially.
No regime can afford to take desertion lightly, but outright treason, actual and legitimate identification with the occupied, the exploited, that it cannot countenance under any circumstance. If one's entire ideology is built on a myth of essentialized superiority, of a difference between the master and the slave that is innate and natural and impossible to transcend, then legitimizing any porosity between the two contradictory categories, permitting any identification of the humane self with the dehumanized other, has to be treated as an existential threat, a possible catastrophe in the making. Traitors to the regime need to be sought out and suppressed with all possible zeal, every last one stamped out and marginalized to the utter fringes, which all ultimately amounts to this. If society ever erroneously constructs a transsexual, she needs to be immediately, instantly destroyed.
Yeah, with the background that the Scottish Gender Recognition Act Reform Bill was denied royal assent on instruction by the Prime Minister, you have a scenario where then rather than putting it to the Crown to decide on this matter has now been put to a UK court because they are the highest authority on law of the land. And you can see where maybe they might have some vested interests in keeping things the way that they were. But, oh no, they had to go so much further. And we'll get into that later. To get into the specifics of what rights I have actually lost here. The Gender Reform Act, the GRA, was enacted due to the fact that the UK lost a court case at the European Court for Human Rights, where they stated that it would be against the human rights of trans people to leave them in a kind of legal limbo where they were neither really men and neither really women. So the Gender Recognition Act was put in place to allow trans people to be able to be legally recognized as their acquired sex and gender. In practice, where this comes into play are in things like marriage. So a trans woman would be legally recognized as a woman if she wanted to marry a cisgender man, because at the time gay marriage was illegal, and we'll get into that. So by accessing a gender recognition certificate, a trans woman would be able to get a marriage certificate and be recorded as a wife, and even just legally allowed to marry, so long as it was now a legally opposite sex marriage, a heterosexual marriage. This also allowed trans people to be recorded in death as their acquired legal sex and name, and would be able to change their birth certificate. In essence, what this bill does is it allows someone to change the past and change the future and change the present so that they are legally recognized, always have, always will be. Then the Equality Act comes into play. The Equality Act 2010 is an attempt to consolidate lots of different anti-discrimination bills that were already in place, including things like the Sex Discrimination Act and the Disability Rights Act, into one piece of legislation that covers all bases, that can provide a singular framework via which discrimination would be unlawful and would provide legal protections for a number of protected classes. Now, interestingly, part of this act, which is where a lot of this trouble comes from, there's an ambiguity in this act when it refers to trans people that has essentially created a stalemate in both the trans rights movement, because you can argue that we have rights in the Equality Act, but also in the anti-trans movements, where the act provides the ability to discriminate against trans people. And so there's an argument that the things that they're asking for don't need to be put in place because those are already legally possible. Practically possible is kind of a different situation. The way that the Equality Act was understood prior to yesterday, I mean, yesterday as of filming, we're filming this on Thursday, this judgment came out on Wednesday, was that trans people have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and with the ability to have a gender recognition certificate, which you are also not allowed to ask for as proof, that trans people kind of existed in this legal gray area where you couldn't discriminate against trans people on the basis of they might have a gender recognition certificate, and therefore you would be doing a sex discrimination. They did, however, put in exceptions. So, as it was understood, if you had, for instance, a woman's shelter, a refuge for survivors of domestic abuse, where cis women with PTSD might be negatively impacted or unable to access a service due to trauma or anything like that, that it would be reasonable to exclude a trans woman who is the source of that problem on the basis that if they have any masculine visible traits that are causing distress to the other service users, this will be a reasonable act of discrimination because it achieves a legitimate aim of consoling or ensuring that those who really need to use the service are able to. Practically, what this came out to is that you are unable to make a de facto ban on trans women in women-only spaces, but you may discriminate on individual cases. So it becomes a case where, sometimes a trans woman might accidentally be allowed into a women's refuge and cause no problems because the other service users don't realize that she's trans and so therefore aren't triggered by her presence. That's okay. But if she is too masculine looking, never mind any cis woman who can fall into this category. We don't look at that. We don't think about it. We don't make policy about it for certain. Or do we? You have a legal framework where frictions arise, there are ways around it that don't negatively impact the organization that's providing this service. That's how it was relatively understood. And so you have instances where certain service providers are inclusive to trans women because they're decent human beings and want to help people in need. And you have certainly some situations where an organization is perhaps afraid to exclude any trans women because they might fall afoul of the Equality Act. This might have been some contention for, only the past 6 years, 7 years at most. There might have been some fringe groups arguing about this, but this has only become a mainstream issue very recently.
We've set out plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, streamlining and demedicalising the process for changing gender, because being trans is not an illness and it shouldn't be treated as such.
What has now changed is that the Supreme Court have interpreted the intention of the law. So it goes into a lot of stuff, but specifically in this case that we're discussing, their understanding of the intention of the law is that it couldn't possibly have meant that trans women are automatically included except in particular use cases where a masculine appearance may cause distress in others, into a single-sex space is de facto able to discriminate against trans women, and that this provision that someone who appears masculine might cause distress to the other users is on the basis of a trans man. If a trans man is a victim of domestic assault and is seeking support in a women's refuge, because, let's be honest, where else are they going to go? If their appearance is sufficiently masculine that they may cause distress to the other cisgendered service users, then this is an instance where you can discriminate against someone of the same sex on the basis of gender reassignment. This is a lawful case of discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment, the exact opposite of how the Act was understood beforehand.
The court explains that the exclusion is intended to additionally prohibit trans people from accessing spaces aligned with their biological sex. This still lets anti-trans activists have their cake and eat it too, forcing trans people out of public life in many spaces. Giving the example of a counselling session for female victims of sexual assault, the court determines that, as sex means biological sex, trans women would automatically be excluded from attendance. It explains the group might also choose to exclude trans men if proportionate, for example if reasonable objection is taken to their presence, for example because the gender reassignment process has given them a male appearance. Lots of people argue against the exclusion of trans women from women's toilets by pointing to trans men. Surely, they ask, you don't want a bearded trans man using the women's loo. But the argument of the court shows the danger of relying on these rhetorical traps, which also enforce gendered norms about how people should look to use certain toilets. The reality is that the anti-trans campaigners don't want trans people to exist, let alone use any public toilets.
One thing I want to make clear at this point is that the ruling does specify able to. So they're removing a protection. Essentially, no trans woman can argue that they should be included under the Equality Act under this ruling. However, they're not enforcing necessarily that service providers have to do this. This is brought slightly into contention by Baroness Faulkner of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who is jumping at the bit to finally enact her years-long plan to provide concrete advice that single-sex spaces must exclude trans women.
Some campaigners say the EHRC is not protecting transgender rights. Last year's campaigners called for the EHRC's status as an independent group to be revoked over a row about its response to Scotland's plans to make it easier for people to change their sex on their birth certificate. Further tensions have since emerged after Baroness Faulkner advised the UK government that it was worth considering redefining sex as biological sex in the Equality Act, in an area that she described as polarised and contentious. A clarification to the Equality Act could make it easier to exclude transgender people from single-sex spaces. Earlier this month, 30 LGBTQ+ charities, led by Stonewall, wrote to the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, saying the EHRC was a failed institution and set on a course that would lead directly to the rolling back of trans people's rights in Great Britain.
So these are two separate kind of issues, but one is at least creating a stronger foundation for the other one. The thing that everyone is congratulating this ruling for is providing common sense and much needed clarity. Clarity for what? Discrimination against trans people. I mean, let's be clear. There are still lots of protections in place. So if I was working in a company, I couldn't be fired on the basis of being trans. That I still have a protection against. But the most frightening aspect of this ruling are the ways that they decided to define sex. And sex is a fascinating concept in the world that we live in. Because I think for the last half a century, 70 years maybe, it's been relatively understood that we don't go there. We can all just live in the fiction and pretend that sex is a common sense issue, that everybody knows what it is. Of course we do. Just don't look at it too closely. Because if you do, then the cracks start to show. And as such, I mean, it genuinely just seems like a thing that has been avoided.
It is not the role of the court to adjudicate on the arguments in the public domain on the meaning of gender or sex, nor is it to define the meaning of the word woman, other than when it is used in the provisions of the Equality Act 2010. Under the Equality Act 2010, sex is understood as a binary, being a man or a woman. For the purposes of the Act, a person's legal sex is their biological sex as recorded on their birth certificate. The references to a man and woman can only be interpreted by their biological meaning for obvious reasons. The reference to a person is otherwise rendered meaningless, and the provision is unworkable.
Or at least it's been understood that we base it off of a common understanding of what it is. But again, just don't ask anyone specifically, because if you're trying to give a definite answer, then you open yourself up to contradictions. You open yourself up to exceptions. And we all just kind of need to keep on pretending that this is a real thing, that there are only two sexes and they make sense. And that's just fine. And we'll all just live our lives dancing around the issue. This is something very clearly pointed at in 1991 in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
Foucault points out that juridical systems of power produce the subjects they subsequently come to represent. Juridical notions of power appear to regulate political life in purely negative terms, that is, through the limitation, prohibition, regulation, control, and even protection of individuals related to that political structure through the contingent and retractable operation of choice. But the subjects regulated by such structures are, by virtue of being subject to them, formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with the requirements of those structures. If this analysis is right, then the juridical formation of language and politics that represent women as the subject of feminism is itself a discursive formation and effect of a given version of representational politics. And the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted by the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. This becomes politically problematic if that system can be shown to produce gendered subjects along a differential axis of domination, or to produce subjects who are presumed to be masculine. In such cases, an uncritical appeal to such a system for the emancipation of women will clearly be self-defeating.
You know, we don't want to create a strict definition, because that's very restricting. It's very imposing. It's building up the bars around us. But at the same time, we all kind of just agree that there are bars somewhere, and that it's common sense. I mean, who needs an actual definition? Who needs a real explanation when you just have common sense?
It means you may be genetically male or female, chromosomally male or female, hormonally male-female non-binary, with cells that may or may not hear the female-male non-binary call, and all these leading to a body that can be male, non-binary, female. Of course, you could try appealing to the numbers. Most people are either male or female, you say. Except that, as a biologist professor, I will tell you. The reason I don't have my students look at their own chromosome in class is because people could learn that their chromosomal sex doesn't match their physical sex, and learning that in the middle of a 10-point assignment is just not the time. Biological sex is complicated. Before you discriminate against someone on the basis of biological sex and identity, ask yourself, have you seen your chromosomes? Do you know the genes of the people you love? The hormones of the people you work with? The state of their cells? Since the answer will obviously be no, please be kind. Respect people's rights to tell you who they are, and remember that you don't have all the answers. Again, biology is complicated. Kindness and respect don't have to be.
Those pesky biologists and exploration of different traits and how they impact in different ways. Why couldn't they have just stuck to the scripture? It's Adam and Eve, not Exy and XX. All right, let's do some history. Specifically British history, because my Roman Empire is the Gali in the Roman Empire. And specifically the evidence of the Gali, of worship of the Gali, of reverence of the Gali, we'll get into that, extends to the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire, to the most westwardly point in Wales, where I currently reside. So who are the Galli? The Galli, as historians love to refer to them, are the Roman third sex.
Shelley Hales wrote, Greek and Roman literature consistently reinforces the sexual and racial difference of eunuchs by stressing how different they look. They were presented as wearing bright clothes, heavy jewelry, makeup, and sporting bleached and crimped hair. Because the Galli castrated themselves and wore women's clothing, accessory, and makeup, some modern scholars have interpreted them as transgender. Firmicus Maternus said, they say they are not men. They want to pass as women. He elaborated, animated by some sort of reverential feeling, they actually have made this element air into a woman, Celestis, the goddess. For because air is an intermediary between sea and sky, they honor it through priests who have womanish voices. The Galli may also have occupied a third gender in Roman society. Jacob Latham has connected the foreign nature of Magna Mater and her priests' non-conforming gender presentation. They may have existed outside Roman constructions of masculinity and femininity altogether, which can explain the adverse reactions of Roman male citizens against the Galli's transgression of gender norms.
They're a religious order worshipping the great mother goddess Cybele. Are we doing Cybele? Cybele, Cybele, Cybele. And the order was majority comprised of castrated males who were treated in Roman society as women, or at least inhabited female roles. They dressed as women, they looked as women, they lived as women, but they're not trans though. Very important that we don't call them trans, because trans is a modern concept that only came to play in the 20th century. So we mustn't apply transness in the past, because we can't ask them. We can't go back in time and ask them how they would like to be identified, if we could even explain to them what a trans person is. Oh my God. Now, the Western world, quite specifically Britain, but certainly America too, loves to point to third sexes in the rest of the world as some kind of enlightened view on gender and sex. They often cite how people are revered, they are looked up to, they are seen as good luck, as being magical, as powerful. Okay. So not to jump the gun here, but I'm just going to state outright as we get into this, this is a method of reinforcing the sex binary. Because if you establish that you have men and women, and then the others act as a fail state that protects the rest of the binary. We've spoken a few times on this channel about the fantastic work that Talia Barth has done in her new book, Trans Radfem. And her essay, The Third Sex, is informing a lot of what we are going to talk about here. Specifically, Talia goes into India's treatment of the Hijra as a third sex and the framework that they occupy in patriarchal Indian society.
In the Indian subcontinent, Hijra are transgender, intersex, or eunuch people who live in communities that follow a kinship system. In Western terms, most Hijras are feminine identifying people assigned male at birth. Hijras are officially recognized as a third gender throughout countries in the Indian subcontinent, being considered neither completely male nor female. Many Hijras today live in well-defined and organized all Hijras communities led by a guru. These communities have consisted over generations of those who are in abject poverty or who have been rejected by or fled their family of origin. Many of them are sex workers.
I'm going to talk about the Galli because, like I said, the Galli made it to Wales. So these are my people. These are my ancestors. Even in Roman society, the Galli were regarded with suspicion. I mean, it gets worse as the Christianity comes in, when it becomes Roman Catholic, it gets much worse. But even during the Roman Republic, during the Roman Empire, the Galli were not treated, well, I mean, they weren't Roman citizens. Rome made it illegal for Roman citizens to be Galli. The worship of Cybele was viewed as a foreign religion, as the incursion of a foreign goddess into Roman society. Yes, there is reverence for their holiness as a priestly order, as a priestessly order, but what they occupy is a social construct of the failed state of maleness. It's worth highlighting that Roman citizenship doesn't mean the same thing that we think it does now. Like, citizenship of a nation state, that's a relatively new concept. Part of the reason that the Roman Republic fell was into the idea of including more people under Roman citizenship. And the consolidation of power was against this, and Caesar happened. We end up with the Roman Empire, a dictatorship. Oh, God. So as much as inclusive historians would like to point to a certain reverence, a certain upholding of a third gender or a third sex in a specific society, what they are really doing is orientalizing this social construct as a way of protecting the binary, to establish the binary as fact with exceptions.
Succinctly, mere categorization does not constitute violence and injustice. Rather, the aggrandizement of one category at the expense of the others, enforced and upheld at the sociocultural and institutional level, is what makes the gender binary unjust. In ever plainer terms, it's male supremacy stupid. The existence of a third sex does no more to challenge societal male supremacy than does the existence of a fourth, fifth, or even second sex. Every sex that is not the first amongst sexes, that is not the most valued, most esteemed, the most adored sex, simply becomes another sexual resource to be exploited. Patriarchy's basis is not inherently a dichotomy, and the rich history of trans-feminized populations across cultures, including the West, ought to have illustrated that plainly. The existence of hijras did little to change Hinduism's enshrinement of male supremacy, and the existence of transsexual has only made the West's ideological commitments to a dualistic sex model more pronounced. Thus, third sexing, far from being a challenge to patriarchy, seems to be a surprisingly historical feature of its operation.
This will be important. This will be on the final test. I mean, it's just like a weird thing anyway. The worship of Cybele becomes about like castrating yourself because of a story about Cybele and Attis. So like a boar, I think one of the gods like turns into a boar and castrates Attis in one story. It gets so confused because Attis and Cybele originally come from Turkey, which again is Anatolia, which is a very mountainous region. So Cybele is viewed as like the great mother, the mountain. She's a mountain goddess, but
if there's a boar involved, it reminds me of
a boar is often involved. There's so many times when a boar is involved. Yeah,
well.
Yeah, the Adonis, Persephone, and Aphrodite story is very derivative of the Cybele and Attis story. I mean, Attis is very often viewed to be a syncretization with Adonis. That's the idea of like Aphrodite being a foreign goddess to Greece, is it comes from this Anatolian myth. But also like the Anatolian worshippers of Cybele didn't castrate themselves. Like this seems to just be like an idea of Greece, potentially of Greece a little bit, but very much of the Romans, that the Cybele priestesses have all castrated themselves. But actually when you go into the records, like most of them didn't. A lot of them married men, some of them married women. Like it's just very reflective of the social construct of the transsexual that we have today. But no, it would be cruel to the past to classify them as transgender. Anyway, that's my way of getting that rant. I'm like, yeah, I can't actually think of a way to say this in a constructive manner, so I just need to go into rant mode now.
Yeah, that's fair. I love the rant mode.
So anyway, as the Roman Empire becomes more and more Christian, Christians start to more explicitly hate the Galli, the sex traitors, the gender traitors, the men. What depravity must they be under that would lead them to do such a thing? Becomes much more like outright hateful. And eventually, as the Roman Empire falls to be replaced by the Holy Roman Empire, this concept just disappears completely. And in Europe, I mean, I don't know for how long, but for at least 1,000 years, the entire idea that one can change their sex disappears from public knowledge. It's just not a thing anyone really knows about. However, this does create a very interesting scenario for we mustn't call them trans people, but the people who wish to live as the opposite sex. Because nobody knows that there is any kind of other way of being, most people who decide to transition and live as the other sex just kind of get away with it. They're invisible, they're just accepted as who they are. Lots of trans men join monasteries because the ascetism that is associated with Christianity is a great way of controlling one's bodily functions. The fasting leads to end to menstruation and absence of periods. The losing weight can reduce breasts, and the robes that they have to wear, and the gendered signifiers of the monastery, of the monks compared to, say, nuns, is very clear and demonstrates to the public, as we'll call them. It feels weird to call people in medieval Europe public, but yeah. Very clear gender signifiers that everyone just kind of understands, if you dress this way, if your hair's like this, then you're a man, obviously. There's this fantastic example of a trans man monk in Syria, or what is today Syria, that was kicked out of his monastery because a woman in the local village accused him of impregnating her. And rather than give up the bit and say, well, no, I couldn't possibly be, because how could I? He just goes along with it. He's like, okay, if that's your ruling, then this is my son now. And in 18 years' time, however many years' time, when he's old enough to join the monastery, we're going to rejoin together. And he wasn't discovered until he died. And they went to prepare the body for burial. And this is how trans people essentially live for a millennia. I mean, let's be clear, there are lots of people who maybe would have transitioned if it was an idea that they could. Part of gender being a spectrum is that there's always going to be people who, if they aren't presented with an option, just aren't going to try that hard to find one. But there are always going to be people who find the proposition of living as their assigned sex just completely untenable and find a way to get around it. That's just always been the case and will always continue to be the case. This is what we mean when we say that trans people have always existed and always will exist. There have always and always will be people who do not accept their predestination based on their genitals at birth. And then capitalism happens. Let's not get it wrong. I mean, I've recently seen criticisms for Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, that it paints an idea that patriarchy is a capitalistic invention. I don't think it necessarily does, personally, but there's certain frameworks in which Federici perhaps over-glamorizes the medieval peasant life as being perhaps a not necessarily patriarchal system, because women were able to work. But working class women have always worked. That's just how it goes. Like, yes, there is a feudal lord lady patriarchy going on, where as far as establishing like the royal bloodline or whatever is clearly delineated by birth sex. Again, whatever that is. And like, yes, you have the Norman invasion of the UK that really establishes fee-tail as the, you know, the line of succession passing through the firstborn male of the lineage.
Fee-tail was established during feudal times by landed gentry to attempt to ensure that the high social standing of the family, as represented by a single patriarch, continued indefinitely. The fee-tail allowed a patriarch to perpetuate his bloodline, family name, honor and armorials in the persons of a series of powerful and wealthy male descendants. By keeping his estate intact in the hands of one heir alone, in an ideally indefinite and preordained chain of succession, his own wealth, power and family honor would not be dissipated among several male lines, where a formerly great landowning family could be reduced in a few generations to a series of smallholders or peasant farmers. It therefore approaches the true corporation, which is a legal body or person which does not die and continues in existence and can hold wealth indefinitely. The heirs in the tale must be the children begotten by the landowner, usually restricting succession to certain heirs of the body and excluding others.
And this is where it comes down to a lot. It's always like fucking inheritance rights, it's property rights. You know, that's what the Galli were forbidden from doing as not being Roman citizens. They couldn't own property. They couldn't inherit. They gave up their rights to be anything other than an aberration in society that's wheeled out for the occasional festival. But what Caliban and the Witch does go into is a very specific change to the way society is structured, where it is not just the role of the aristocratic woman to produce male heirs for the lineage, but it becomes the role of the working class woman to produce the new labor force. I mean, fuck, we call giving birth going into labor. I mean, how obvious can we be about this stuff? There's been criticism of Silvia Federici for the way that she categorizes men and women into essentially like humans and brood mares. That what a woman is to early modern era society is that they are just only for birth, and this doesn't really account for identity because we know that some of those women are going to be trans men. But what this essentially comes down to is a disagreement about how we view our frameworks. There's feminist analysis that works from a top-down viewpoint, so the structure that is dictated by the top of the hierarchy and how everyone gets classified into down below that, and one of personal identity that works outwards from there. And you know, both have their value, but when we're looking at the structures of society, top-down is a very valid way to look at things because this is what these laws end up being based on, as we'll get into. So, women are just breeding stock. They aren't for work. They're only to do the domestic labor that isn't really labor because it's not paid, because being paid for labor is the only thing that's valuable. So because women aren't paid for their labor, it's not really labor. But we call going to birth labor because that's the real labor that we care about for women, is their ability to reproduce the labor force. And a lot of Federici's argument is that the witch trials are an exercise, it's a bludgeon, it's a tool to keep women in line, to strip away any sense of agency or autonomy that women could have under the threat of being burnt as a witch. So it's not that any of these people necessarily were witches, but that any kind of woman that steps out of line, that steps outside of this patriarchal delineation of how the will should be structured is to work with the devil. It is to invite the devil into your womb and corrupt it or something. And that you should be hanged or killed. I mean, it doesn't really matter how many are killed during the witch trials, but the threat is there. Just as the Gallia existed in Roman society as a fail state for men to fall into, the witch acts as a fail state for both men and women to fall into, for those who do not abide by the patriarchy rule of what men and women are for. Men are for work, women are for making workers. And it's important to bring in at this point that a lot of the trans-exclusionary radical feminist viewpoints are essentially to take this as fact. Transphobia is a thing and TERFism is a thing. And personally, I have quite a high standard for what I describe as being TERFy. I think it's a very specific ideology, and it's one that decides that women's oppression is based on biological reality. That their biological femaleness puts them at a physical and real disadvantage, and that's where inequality stems from. And it enshrines the idea that women are naturally inferior and that we should protect them on the basis of just kind of being kind. This isn't Federici's argument when she creates these social categories of male and woman. What she argues is that this is a space under which humans can be categorized into human and property.
Consider a mechanism whose sole function is to classify all inputs it receives as one of two categories, 1 and 0. The inputs, it must be said, vary greatly in temperament, expression, embodiment, internality, and so on. But that isn't as much of a hurdle for the machine as it seems. It has been programmed with a few simple lines of code that enable it to differentiate between ones and zeros with acceptable margins of tolerance. Ones tends to look and behave like this. Zeros tend to be like that. These truisms are crude, simplistic, and even reductive, true, but they work. As such, the machine chugs on, happily reducing complex inputs to a blunt binary classification, its delivery day code having been deemed good enough. Truthfully, the machine has three outputs: 1, 0, with a degree of confidence, and null. It's just that the exceptions are caught and sorted into the 0 category, because that method of handling the machine's limitations still keeps things running smoothly. It's not much of an issue at all. There's no real need to examine the machine any further. No need to pay attention to the way its null exceptions keep rising in volume. No need to examine it for any shortcomings, oversights, or any weaknesses.
With the assumption on which is which being predicated on the examination of genitalia at birth. This is a materialist framework. This is looking at how things worked and how they affected people, rather than looking at it from an identity framework in which, obviously trans men are going to be punished under this framework because they are failing to fulfill their societal duty as being broodmares. However, to bring Talia Barth back into the discussion, I think the very useful framework that Talia adds, and Silvia Federici does as well at certain points, but the thing that Talia really hammers home in her work, which is fucking fantastic, please, for the love of God, if you do nothing else, read Trans Rad Femme, is that there's always been 3 sexes, 3 genders, 3 whatever you want to classify it as in society. You have human, you have broodmares, and you have fuckmeat. The role of fuckmeat in the scenario is an object through which men can vent their frustrations at life.
By the end of the 15th century, efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex and turned class antagonism into an antagonism against proletarian women. In France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, provided that the victims were women of the lower class. The institutionalization of prostitution, implemented through the opening of municipal brothels, soon proliferated throughout Europe. Enabled by the contemporary high-wage regime, state-managed prostitution was seen as a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth, who in state brothels could enjoy a privilege previously reserved for older men. Prostitution was officially recognized as a public service. Even the church came to see prostitution as a legitimate activity. The state-managed brothel was believed to provide an antidote to the orgiastic sexual practices of the heretic sects, and to be a remedy for sodomy, as well as a means to protect family life. We thus serve as objects of macabre fascination for cissexuals, either an hypersexualized fantasy with no autonomy or agency of its own, or a monstrous creature whom it is permissible to abhor, violate, and brutalize. Therefore, we are only ever subconsciously regarded as women. We are womanized in the way everything considered beneath a man is feminized, yet our womanhood is repudiated, even as those who seek to destroy us bring the full force of misogynistic degradation to bear. We are assaulted and told we invited assault, that our deviancy and perversion and pretension to womanhood carries implicit permission for deviants and perverts to treat us like women. We are discriminated against in employment and housing, frequently impoverished and turned out onto the streets, pushed disproportionately into survival sex work, and routinely face stringent access barriers to transition technologies. The enlightened West, in all its wisdom, already has a third sex, the trans.
It's a person that they can fuck without the risk of procreation. She very rightly highlights that Hijra are viewed in the same way that Indian society views infertile women, whether that be old women who've gone through menopause or those who are just unable to bear children.
Indeed, in the eyes of Indian patriarchy, Hijra is an expansive category, one that is meant to encompass all those deemed, bluntly, sexually defective. Girls who do not menstruate may be considered Hijra, and while intersex individuals were the minority amongst them, they too are stigmatized and ostracized into Hijra communities. The third sex, such as it is not a prescriptive category, but a dumping ground, a landfill in which to deposit everyone that a society organized around the reproductive imperative considers extraneous and aberrant.
Often this applies to sex work, an avenue through which many third sexes in society, whether it be the Gali, the Hijra, or the Feminiali in Naples that we have today, that's the only way that they can make a living, because if they want to live as women, they can't, because the role of a woman is to give birth, whether that's to continue the patriarchal lineage, or if it's to produce a labor force. Because trans-feminized women are unable to perform this act, this is the category that they get put into. A place that is also occupied by both gay men and cisgendered women. It is the realm of the demonized, of the monstrous. The thing that you can come in, but you would never take home to mother.
It's me, that's me, that's me.
And then out of capitalism, the Enlightenment happens. I said in the last video that we were going to do a video essay on Enlightenment. This might be it. This might be the thing that includes it. I don't know if we're going to necessarily go more into this. But I mean, fuck if this isn't a fan-fucking-tastic example of how it goes wrong. And I want to be clear here, because the Enlightenment gets like a lot of credit for establishing science and the scientific method and the reification of rationality and truth, but that just has never been the case. There have been scientists for thousands of years in hundreds of cultures, and it has never been an issue that any of them had religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs or believed in magic at the same time. Science has always been this open platform I mean, always been. It now isn't, but it was. It was this open platform that priests took part in. Some of the highest in society would be priests of certain orders that would sit on king's courts to try and make sense of the world. You have astrology coming out of Asia. We have calculus and scientific principles coming, and philosophy coming out of Greece. I mean, there was polytheism. We had so many of the philosophical ideas that we still hold today come from polytheism and paganism. But still, the Enlightenment happens because, as happened with the Roman Empire, if you concentrate too much power at the top, the whole thing crumbles down and you need to rebuild. So essentially what we have is an issue where the Catholic Church has too much power. It can dictate what the truth is. And the rationalists come forward and say, aha, but you fools, you believe in a sky god. You believe in the ancient words on a text that is so long out of date that we've moved on, we're too advanced, we can't follow these ideas anymore. And they reject spirituality outright. I mean, that's not even true. I mean, so many of the scientists that come later are religious, but they set up the rules. Okay, this is what happens. They set up the rules on what can be accepted as truth. The church previously had the will of God that they would fall back to, the word of God, the will of God, whatever the Pope says, God says, or whatever God means. It's all about a concentration of authority, and the Enlightenment really just acts into a reconsolidation of power of what truth means. But here's the catch. The people who instituted this new philosophy got to make up the rules. So while it may be fairly understood in early modern periods in the 1700s that women are weak and emotional and irrational and only good for one thing, the Enlightenment gets to classify this as fact, as a biological reality. They get to say that midwives and women who've been practicing women's health that haven't been using this new fantastic thing called the scientific method, they haven't studied, they haven't read books, maybe they don't even need to read. I mean, screw their years of experience of helping people, of creating community consensus amongst themselves. No, the men get to come in and decide that none of that matters. They get to put in books why none of that matters. They get to explain exactly why women are inferior. They get to explain exactly why women are perfect as broodmares, as what women are for, what women are good for. And they get to invent new ways to police that. So enters the field of psychiatry and female hysteria. My favorite thing about hysteria is that it acts as an explanation for a knowledge gap. It's not based in anything observable or provable. It's a conjecture. But because the men are in charge, they get to present this as fact. They get to put it in the books. When men were suddenly becoming entirely in charge of female health, they get given the epistemic authority on what is happening. So when women are coming to them or are being presented to them with specific symptoms that don't make sense, that they can't really explain, they just get to base that on a facet of feminine reality. That the female brain is too emotional, it's too irrational, and so sometimes it just makes up problems, that the female brain is so dangerous that it can harm the body that it inhabits. What they're actually coming onto is the psychosomatic nature of trauma, of the body and mind's rejection of what it's being put through, of the way that it's being treated. horrible atrocities were committed against women in this period, either via medical experimentation or terrible, horrendous advice given to husbands on how to correct these issues. And we now know, many, many years later, that this falls into the categories of dissociation and trauma. That emotional trauma can present as physical pain, as physical ailments. But that wasn't the case then, and they're the ones who are in charge, and they're the ones who got to decide what the truth was. In the 1800s, the diagnosis of hysteria is expanded to include queer men. I mean, lesbians were 100% included under a hysteria diagnosis. Any woman who is forced to reproduce the heterosexual regime, of course, is completely traumatized, is unable to comply with what's being demanded of her. And we really institutionalize, again, not that religion didn't instill the idea of patriarchy in a husband's right to rape his wife, but we institutionalize women's rejection of it as a pathological issue. In the 1900s, in Germany, we get the first attempt at changing the way we view things. I don't even know how to frame it. I mean, it's, again, it falls into that same trap of the Gali of the third sex as a way to include those who do not fall within the heterosexual regime of labor and labor producer, and finds a way to stop being horrendous to the exceptions, but in a way that protects the ideals. Homosexuality, I mean, not stops being viewed, but it gets argued to not be a sin, as to not be a depravity, but as a medical condition. We pathologize it in a way that it's saying that there's something wrong with men, because men are good and men work and they're important and they're intelligent and they're rational, and so there must be something wrong with the men who do not fall in line. Magnus Hirschfeld of the Institute of Sexology in Germany starts to introduce the first attempts at structuralizing this deviation from the norm. He proposes the idea of licenses for transvesticism that would allow males to dress up as females, which was outlawed in Germany at the time. He does his research, he creates the first transsexual surgeries and brings trans women together to speak to each other, to share stories, to identify with each other, to find a community. And the Nazis burnt the institute. I think the most important aspect of this is that when queer people were put into the concentration camps with a pink triangle sewn on their sleeve, when the great American and British liberators, when the Allied powers came to liberate the concentration camps, those queer people were put back in jail because it was still illegal to be LGBT. This is a reality that we've come from, and as is blatantly obvious to anyone living in America right now, this is the reality that we are about to return to. What we end up with, though, is two differing ideas of what to do with a specific set of deviant behaviors in the sex class, in the social category of men. The social category of women is very heavily regulated already. In America in the 1950s, as the middle classes expanded, as the capitalistic ideal is truly brought to its conclusion, where the middle class woman is broodmare and domestic slave to her husband, and where they need to invent an entirely new drug to make it bearable for these women. I mean, I say we invent a new drug. A replacement for lobotomies is what we get.
Is Mother okay?
She is now. She just let her womanly emotions get the better of her, that's all. Nothing a little operation couldn't fix.
Operation?
What's broken in the heart can never be repaired, but the brain, well, we have all sorts of science for the brain.
Mother?
Oh, hello.
It's Beatrice.
Yes, that's right. What a pretty girl.
What did they do to you?
Oh, hush. It's okay. Why, I have half a mind.
With the invention of Valium, we dump thousands and thousands of pills of Valium into the American suburbs to placate the women so that they may fulfill their societal role, so that we don't have to lobotomize them anymore. But when it comes to males, when it comes to trans women, we do end up with a differing approach. In America, just as the bedlams of London were filled with the queer degenerates of the 1800s that were beaten into compliance or death, gender divergent males are incarcerated into psychiatric wards where the problem is attempted to be solved. They fail. They no matter what they do, they just cannot break the delusion of these deviants, of these creatures, that they are not their biological reality. They can't medicate it away, they can't beat it away, nothing they do can prevent these freaks, these freak shows, these creatures, that they aren't who they say that they are.
While it is a kind of disability, it is a peculiar one. So, in terms of social construct, what is the nature and purpose of madness? It is to regulate the behaviors and thoughts of normal citizens. When those things breach the line of madness, one is made mad. And to be mad is to be rendered unreliable, unpredictable, and incapable of adequate agency. Once one becomes mad, the sane and the normal are relieved of trying to understand one's thoughts and needs and desires, for those are made inherently incomprehensible. Once one becomes mad, it is assumed one cannot be trusted to make decisions, which the sane make all the time, because the mad are considered consummately and totally incapable of perceiving reality or of making choices that do not harm the self or others. In short, they are a danger to all, including themselves. What is to be done with the mad? First, they must be removed from society, lest they cause harm. Then we must attempt to make them sane, that is, behaving and thinking in ways that are normal. If that is impossible, we must make them seem as sane as possible, so that their madness is confined to their own head and does not spill over. If even that is impossible, they must be removed from society permanently. Otherwise, they will disquiet and disturb the sane, or worse, infect them with madness.
In the UK, on the other hand, while this exists, We end up with a few good souls, some endocrinologists who work out of Harley Street in London, in the West End, and they know that if you provide hormones to trans women, that it helps. And under the UK understanding of sex and birth certificates, because of intersexism, it would be possible that a trans woman who goes through one of these endocrinologists and has sexual reassignment surgery, usually in Casablanca in Morocco, that they could then go and use a doctor's note to say that actually they were mistakenly assigned male at birth on their birth certificate, and that needs to be changed because they've later come to understand that they're intersex. And this would be one of the avenues. As hard to navigate as it was a way for trans people to be actualized as they are. And, you know, it would be a kind of hushed secret given in queer circles, in the secret clubs that gay people would inhabit, where trans women would inevitably gravitate towards. But in America, there's incarceration. And as the psychiatrists become increasingly frustrated as they don't know what to do with these people, they bring in Harry Benjamin, who worked under Magnus Hirschfeld in the Institute of Sexology in Berlin. And he works with one of their patients, and he, apparently having known of this process, gives estrogen, at the time equine estrogen, so it'd be Premarin, to one of these patients that alleviates their distress. And the crux of this issue is that our existence has always been defined by cisgender men as a way to, I don't know, protect their own status, to protect the immutability of their perceived greatness in the social hierarchy that is the heterosexual regime. There's a conference in either 1969 or 1970 where Harry Benjamin, in working with the psychiatrists, provides them with a framework through which they can pathologize trans people.
In the US, young psychiatrist Dr. Richard Green was busy organizing the US-UK Transatlantic First International Symposium on Gender Identity, planned to take place in London in July 1969. Any independent scientific scrutiny would dismiss its assertion that trans people were mentally ill as unresearched, unevidenced, and invalid. Instead, the conference organizers represented their purpose as being to help trans people and got funding from two non-medical, non-scientific charities. The Gender Identity Symposium took place at the Piccadilly Hotel in London on the weekend of the 26th-27th of July, 1969. The symposium was about to deride trans people as inadequate masqueraders of cis men and women. John Money, Richard Green, and John Randall were all committed to the idea that being trans was a psychiatric disorder which they knew best how to manage. The opposition, the endocrinologist who had been treating trans people for over 30 years, was to have it say first, so that it could appear to be listened to, then be dismissed, and a new order established. To obliterate dissenting voices, only the papers given by the new order, the unscientific mental illness framework of Money, Green, and Randall, were published and circulated after the conference, as though no other views had even existed. This was not a scientific meeting dedicated to intellectual enquiry, but a political event determined to create a London GIC operating to the same dogmas as those at UCLA and at Johns Hopkins Hospital. It was an exercise in power, control, and propaganda.
And the endocrinologists that were in the UK and that were helping in the particular way that they didn't fight particularly hard against this. They were just doing what they could. I mean, they were being paid for it. They're Harley Street doctors, for fuck's sake. But the psychiatrists win, and transsexuality gets officially pathologized as a mental illness via which hormone treatments and sexual reassignment surgery are mental health treatments in the same ways that lobotomies and Valium and antidepressants and SSRIs are. They are attempts to alleviate the distress. It is viewed as a delusion on the basis that the patriarchal reality of men and women as laborers and labor producers is fact. And so the transsexual is constructed. Not long after, the first gender identity clinic in London, Tavistock, is established. And around the same time, we start to get our first legal cases in the UK that really establish how few rights trans people really have. The first instance that we get of trying to legislate against transgender rights is in the case of Sempill versus Sempill, in which Ewan Forbes, a trans man who transitioned early in life, was set to inherit his father's title. His cousin, who was next in line, as Fetail does this like jumping over thing. I mean, if you look at the history of English kings, it's very obvious how this happens. But as Ewan had changed his birth certificates that he was set to inherit, his cousin, out of spite, because Ewan wouldn't have been able to have children, there was no further line. When Ewan passed, the line would have passed through his cousin as the next in line anyway, but his cousin found the entire situation just completely abhorrent and had to make a hissy fit fuss out of everything. In court, Ewan wins in a absolutely horrifying scenario of trying to prove his biological sex. He is able, through honestly fucking incredible means, to demonstrate that he is intersex, even though technically he isn't. I mean, the book, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, is a fantastic exploration of this idea and everything that we're talking about right now. Do get it, do read it, because it sets up everything that is going to happen from today onwards. But the court is very annoyed that they have to give it to him, that they cannot legally prove that he is female. And so they bury the case. They make it so that this court case cannot be used as precedent, because the law of Fetail is so immutable, must be protected at all costs, that even when the court can't win, it rigs the game.
The law surrounding male line primogeniture was so old that it had been lost in time, impossible to separate from the fabric of rule and government. When William the Conqueror had instituted it after the Norman conquest in 1066, his intention had been to ensure that the UK lands he appropriated and gifted to his barons could never be removed from them, and that they, in turn, would provide him with a continuous, unbreakable lineage of obligation. Now, it continued to decide not only title, estate, and entitlement, but its archaic conventions also wrapped up billions of pounds and the right to govern by sitting in the House of Lords. Most significantly, the male preference form of primogeniture determined the right to be monarch. If Yuan, as a child wrongly assigned as female at birth, could inherit a male primogeniture title, then succession to the crown and other primogeniture hereditary titles was no longer secure. Male primogeniture, which was supposed to bring stability to the British kingdom by protecting the undisturbed succession to the crown, would be destabilized. Lord Hunter's decision was not just about succession to one baronetcy. It was about the authority, continuity, and supremacy of the whole British establishment. The medical evidence had left no doubt that scientifically, humanity occupied a broad spectrum of female, intersex, and male. All of the experts on both sides made it clear that individual self-declaration was the only valid basis for determining sex. Lord Hunter was aware of this, and he understood fully the implications of his judgment for male primogeniture succession. The route he took was to make the narrowest decision possible, one that limited itself rigidly to the facts of Yuan's case and deliberately avoided creating any new general principles. The opinion he gave was explicitly punitive. His view was that persons who are actually born are either male or female, pointedly ignoring thousands of years of cultural record and all the modern scientific evidence that said exactly the opposite. Defying the UK's most senior medical and scientific opinion, Hunter created his own balance sheet for determining sex. Gonads, apparent sex, psychological sex, and chromosomal sex, with chromosomes being the least valuable of the available criteria. Hunter was clear, and the law must, in my opinion, attempt to draw a firm line which leaves males on one side and females on the other. In particular, trans people were to be kept out of the equation. Hunter was explicit that anything he said was not in their support and that his opinion must not leave a possible loophole for those suffering from sexual aberration or deviation, such as certain transsexual who may have the strongest motives or drives to pass, legally or illegally, from one side of the sexual spectrum to the other, and who, in the event of success in achieving the social sex of their desire, might bring disastrous consequence, not only upon themselves but upon others in the society in which they live.
Until we come to Corbett versus Corbett, which is the case of transgender icon April Ashley. April Ashley transitioned under this previous model we've talked about. She was able to access hormone replacement therapy from the London endocrinologist. She had a sex reassignment surgery in Casablanca in Morocco, and she married a member of the aristocracy because her birth certificate had been changed. And so she was legally female under the previous rules. They got divorced, and as the establishment of the gender identity clinics and the idea of the transsexual comes around, her ex-husband is able to argue that he was tricked into marrying her, that as she was male, as gay marriage is illegal, that he should not owe her alimony payments. That's what it comes down to. A member of the aristocracy, the upper classes, the elite of society, is so beholden to his capital that he cannot for a second concede the idea of losing it to his transgender wife. And so he argues that actually they didn't get divorced. They were never married. The marriage is annulled. And in this case, where the court works in favor of the establishment, this one is set as precedent. It is established that you cannot legally change your sex. And this is mirrored in the gender identity clinic. The doctors that are given the authority over these people's lives, over these people's autonomies, over their right to decide what to do with their own bodies, these men are given authority to dictate the exceptions in which they may be allowed, where they may be permitted to do something different than their predestined legal, biological sex, their assigned sex at birth. In the ironically named BBC documentary, A Change of Sex, we get our first glimpses at the inside of one of these gender identity clinics, where Dr. John Randall, a Welshman, born in Penarth, the greatest shame of my nation, of my people, is given and demonstrates his authority over Julia Grant, a trans woman simply seeking the ability to live as herself.
Oh, since I last saw you, I've had the bust operation done.
Who arranged that?
I saw my GP because my tablets were having side effects. My hair was getting very, very thin.
Well, I should be writing to your GP to find out why he did it without consulting me. Because I'm supposed to be directing your case, because it's primarily a psychiatric matter. And I must confess I take exception to your doing that.
Well, I thought it was something permanent. I needed something to establish that I was doing what I was doing.
It's a medical matter. It isn't a personal choice. I like to be informed. See, once again, you're overstepping the mark, and I don't like it, one bit. I don't wish to appear to be petulant, but really you're not arranging this affair in a manner that fits our protocol. We have a long experience of dealing with people who want this sort of thing done, and we like to do it in our way, when we know what's going on. And I don't like people who step out of line. I find that it's, at the very least, irritating. But I warn you, any attempt to manipulate it will result in my discharging you from my clinic as a patient.
If somebody was to go as a private patient, how long could they expect to wait? Is there an approximate period?
That depends on the availability of a suitable bed and a suitable clinic. But I'm not going to bargain with you as to when it to be done. No decision has been made to do it yet.
I'm finding having difficulties with the guy I'm living with.
So do many of my patients with their associates. Why should you be different?
That's just something that I know I have the finance now to pay for it, and I'd rather get it over with as soon as possible.
Well, having the finance doesn't mean to say that anybody will do it because you have the money. I want to make that point quite clear.
Right.
I don't think you conducted yourself particularly tactfully in all this. And there I think the interview will end. Thank you very much. You'd better come and see me in another 3 months.
I think it's important here to bring back in Harry Benjamin, because he gets a lot of flack from some members of the trans community. In what he was trying to do, he's working within the system. He's trying to be compassionate to his patients, but he's also documenting them in the way that the system kind of dictates that he has to. Harry Benjamin, in examining his patients and trying to decide the best course of action in order to help and facilitate his patients, because he's working within a shitty system, but he is a decent person. He creates this typology, and we get type 1, the pseudo-masculine transvestite. Lives as man, could get occasional kick out of dressing. Not truly transvestite, normal male life. So this is your men who cross-dress for fun. Your drag queens. Fetishistic transvestite, masculine. Lives as man, dresses periodically or part of the time. Dresses underneath male clothes. So this is your man who wears women's underwear underneath his business suit as he goes to work. Type 3, the true transvestite. Masculine, but with less conviction. dresses constantly or as often as possible, may live and be accepted as woman, may dress underneath male clothes if no other choice. So this is someone who, essentially for all intents and purposes, lives as a woman, but expresses so through dress in the same way that the Hijra or the Gali or whoever else you want to point to in society does, if we want to make that claim. Type 4, the transsexual non-surgical. Ooh, we're getting into the weeds here. Undecided, wavering between transvestite and transsexual. Dresses as often as possible with insufficient relief of his gender discomfort. May live as a man or a woman, sometimes alternating. That's like everyone I fucking know. So what's important to highlight here is that, like, at the bottom it comes up with the outcomes that you could provide for this. So for type 1, not interested in estrogen, not interested in conversion operation as sexual reassignment surgery, not interested in therapy. Type 3 is the idea of having a surgical vagina could be attractive. The idea of estrogen medication might be attractive as an experiment, could be helpful emotionally, because of course. And then when we get to the transsexual non-surgical undecided, for sexual reassignment surgery, it's attractive but not requested or attraction not admitted. So those are your dick girls, the feminine penis havers, your me's, your non-binary women, however we want to classify them now. Estrogen medication, transsexuals, non-surgical transsexuals have needed for comfort and emotional balance. And so we get back to the idea that HRT is a form of antidepressant. It's to alleviate distress. Type 5, the true transsexual. Now, lots of people in the trans community know a good true transsexual or two. Moderate intensity though. So not your hyper femme doll. This is your woman that insists that she's a woman, but maybe refuses to like live up to the specific ideals of womanhood as delineated through society. How dare she? Lives and works as a woman if possible. Insufficient relief from dressing. We have sexual orientation in this as well. Libido low. Asexual, autoerotic, or passive homosexual activity. May have been married and have children. I get the idea. Again, the Enlightenment insists that we categorize, always be categorizing. We must establish the truth. We must create the borders. If the borders are fuzzy, it doesn't matter. Don't worry. As long as there are borders, it's fine. It's fine. And so we come to the true transsexual, high intensity, feminine, total psychosexual inversion. May live and work as a woman, dress and gives insufficient relief, gender discomfort intense, intensely desires relations with normal male as female, air quotes, scare quotes. If young, later libido low, may have been married and have children by using fantasies in intercourse. Again, I get it. You're getting different people. We need to categorize patients and try to find outcomes for them. But the problem is that this gets used as a rule of law. Anyone in the following establishment of the Gender Identity Clinic rules, known as the Harry Benjamin rules, anyone less than a transsexual type 5 is deemed not to benefit from HRT or any kind of gender affirming care.
Hi there, Sleepy Next Day Raven here with editing Isha in the background. I think the wine may have run away from me a bit during this section. It has gotten quite rambly, but the point I just want to make sure I reiterate here is that what we have here is a set of very similar experiences that are defined very differently at different times and by different people, whether that applies to sex, gender, or any kind of diversity within. What's important to note is that the people who get to define what these things mean and where they fit into society are those with the power to protect and uphold their own status at the expense of those who are actually experiencing them.
The problem is that we talk to each other. So very quickly during the 80s, the script is known. This is the thing, if you set out rules on who can and who cannot be a woman, and you explicitly state what those rules are, then you're just giving a cheat sheet to anyone who wants to go through it. So you have plenty of trans people in the 70s and 80s who know exactly what to say to the doctors, exactly how to get the desired outcomes that they want. But Raven, you may say, this was the 70s. These were the dark ages of science. These were during the endocrinological dark ages. Like, surely this couldn't be the case today. I mean, there's trans people everywhere. Anyone can be trans. I bring your attention to Dr. James Barrett, who was a protege of Dr. John Randall. Too many J's. Transsexual and Other Disorders of Gender Identity, published in 2007. I mean, this is the thing, like, James Barrett is a protege of Dr. John Randall, the initial doctor of Tavistock. James Randall is still, or has only just very recently retired, if he has, from the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic in London. He is, up until 2019, the man who would have been in charge of my transition until Wales established their own gender identity clinic. Because until 2019, all transgender patients in Wales were transferred to the London clinic. We were funneled out of Wales and into London for our care, through a process where we would have to be referred to the Community Adult Mental Health Services, CAMS, through what was very truthfully named the gatekeeping process, where they got to decide whether or not we could even be referred. Barrett is a deep believer in everything that has been established about transgender identity and transgender symptomology and transgender pathology since the 1970s. And he is, or has been very recently, still inflicting it upon the transgender population.
Male primary transsexuals. Those with an early age of onset, low sexual activity, lack of any history of sexual arousal with cross-dressing, same biological sex sexual orientation, and some degree of gender identity disorder in childhood have been viewed as core or primary transsexuals and thought to have a better prognosis. Almost all are androphilic, and most have a low libido. There is usually a history of being mistaken for female in childhood and of not being bothered about it. Almost all have a solid history of gender identity disorder of childhood, or more rarely, a phase of it followed by a hyper-masculine protest. The extent of childhood femininity in such patients and the degree to which they can come across as female at first appointment can be quite staggeringly great. Rather, the reverse problem is seen in patients who seem to their psychiatrist to pass very poorly, who are without verifiable occupation, and who claim to be living their life in their new gender role. Such patients may sometimes bear their claim upon wearing the appropriate underwear, proudly stating how long they have been in this habit. More often, they state that every item of their clothing is appropriate to their new gender. Often this is technically true, but the final combination that has resulted seems not to be so. A good psychological check is to ask whether a non-gender disordered person of the same build and biological sex could wear the clothes up the high street without drawing a second glance. If this is the case, it seems to be fair that the clothes are taken to be those of the birth sex, despite having been purchased in the other sex clothing store. This can usually be pointed out to such patients. Another test is that of asking patients whether strangers would address the patient as male or female, and if they asked where the nearest toilet was, which sex toilet would be suggested to them. Some patients fiercely maintain that they do not care what others think of them, and that their own conviction of their gender is what matters. This position is at odds with the philosophy of real-life experience, and if followed, seems not to be predictive of a good longer-term outcome. Carried to a logical conclusion, these arguments leads to the view that no change of social gender role is necessary before gender reassignment surgery. This might be philosophically sound, but is associated with a poor outcome.
And this book shows that he's proud of it. Like, he's very happy to outline his methods, his cruelty, his bioessentialism, his rules for gender presentation to decide. I mean, there's this fantastic aspect in the book that I just adore in a way that is filled with hatred and vile despicableness. He repeatedly states in the books about a transgender prognosis. And you know, I'm thinking to myself as I'm reading this fucking book, because I love to self-harm, that, God, what does he mean by prognosis? Like, what is his definition of prognosis? And then he outright states in the book that it's passability. It's the ability for the outcomes of the procedures that he is going to allow his patients to take part in to give the desired effects. Again, as I pointed out before, this is about accommodating a certain subset of society so that we don't have to kill them outright. Maybe I didn't say kill them outright before, but that is, so we don't have to kill them outright. So we can accommodate them in without threatening the gender binary, without threatening the sex binary, without threatening the heterosexual regime. And how this manifests in practice through the 1970s, through to the 2000s, through to the 2010s, is that we only allow to transition those who may succeed at it. Those who may not make obvious their transness, to sully the good name of woman, to sully the good name of man. If they're going to live at the opposite sex, they better fucking succeed at it by their rules. And this, you know, let's not get this fucking wrong. This is all just a fucking power play. I mean, A Change of Sex clearly demonstrates the way that Randall was just like a fucked up dominatrix who liked to have power over other human beings' destiny. And I mean, how many women have gone to the doctors and felt the same of like, why is this fucking dude getting to decide what happens to my body? And this is the shared struggle. This is the fight. So anyway, in the UK, we have the idea of the constructed transsexual, where we may place our fail state men and women. We have legal protections in place, though, so that they may not completely disrupt the structure of things. For instance, the Gender Recognition Act, when they were forced to put it into place, includes a very specific provision that any born male person who decides to transition gives up their right of inheritance. And that any born female person who transitions does not gain the right of inheritance of land or title or capital. You know, you can put it in the will, but as far as fee tail is concerned, we literally legislated exceptions to this 1,000-year-old rule. But the problem is that the cat's out of the fucking bag now. Just as it was in ancient Rome, just as it is in India, just as it is in any other country that accepts trans people or creates its own weird third fucking gender, third sex, where they can put the fail states. If you create the social category, people will align themselves to it. That's what's happened with the transsexual in the 20th and the 21st century. We were originally allowed to do it only if it was secret. And then as things got more and more open, as we became more and more visible, as we began to threaten the heterosexual regime, as we began to threaten the biological reality of sex, the males are males and females are females, the XY is the laborer and the XX is the producer of labor, as the more we began to challenge that notion, the more problems we create. I really didn't think we would get to this point. Like, threats against the Equality Act, threats against the Gender Recognition Act have been coming in for a long time now. And the consensus amongst the trans community was that, you know, it was left just vague enough that they could both claim inclusion and exclusion at the same time, whilst protecting the biological reality of sex to a way that wasn't challenging, that wasn't too confining, but at the same time wasn't too inclusive to allow anyone to just do whatever they wanted, because we still need to maintain the idea. If I'm going to give any credit to liberal feminism, to white feminism, it really fucking killed the arguments of the wider feminism movement. As long as we can have female CEOs, as long as we can have the boss girls and the boss bitches and the boss babes, then it just becomes an issue of wages, of labor, of upholding the capitalistic doctrine, and kills the idea of discrimination in any real sense other than that which falls under capitalistic lines. Emma, Dolphin Diaries on Substack and on Blue Sky and on Tumblr, put out today a fantastic essay on the issue at its heart. The provenance is incredible because she frames it as a court case on the court of public opinion that is between the detransitioned woman versus the trans man. As we saw with the Kira Bell case in 2019, where for a short period, transgender healthcare for teenagers in the UK was shut down. It was overturned and then has been shut down again by the Cass Review as the Enlightenment era on establishing the establishment as the ultimate authority on all things gets to decide the destiny of its subjects. And she frames this wonderful argument of transition as a form of disability.
What happens when one cannot meet the standard of labor? What is someone who cannot contribute enough to be normal? Every human's capacity is limited, but some limits lie at or above the arbitrary standard of labor, and some below. Failure to meet standard capacity is, quite plainly, disability. I speak specifically, now and henceforth, of the social construct of disability. Just as sex and gender, it encompasses human features which may exist regardless of social order. Just as sex and gender, it constructs archetypes and social scripts that serve a purpose. What is the social purpose of disability? Of the infirm, the crippled, the wretched? Sometimes it is to make a large performance of helping them. Only those that truly deserve it, of course. Never forget the truly deserving, being truly in pain. But much more importantly, across history, disability existed to move the disabled to the margins of society, render them vulnerable and reliant on goodwill when they cannot be cured of being insufficient. They cannot adequately contribute, which makes them dead weights on the finite resources earned by other people's labor. That's why deserving is so important, you see. Because all people are constantly trying to shrink their fair share of labor, don't they? Wouldn't we all not work if we could choose not working? This is the occasion in which I remind you you're watching a video essay that took months, years in the making, done by disabled people who gets no payment for this. If you want to support our work, go to Coffee Now, please. If we granted this sort of charity to just anybody, if we kept encouraging this sort of behavior, think of the finite resources. You and I, real, honest, hard-working people, will be the last atlas shouldering humanity. Oh, it's unthinkable. No. We have to ensure the disabled demonstrate real, provable pain that renders them utterly and definitely incapable of working as much as we do. Otherwise, the world will end. Entertain the notion that the organizing principle of patriarchy is distribution of feminized labor. Sexing and gendering is then a social mechanism by which labor roles are assigned and maintained, and within the current and millennial standing incarnation of the patriarchy, these roles are assigned at birth, based on the external appearance of infant genitalia, and therefore expectation of the baby's future gestational or inseminatory capacity. From there, an entire hierarchy blossoms, in which those deemed men are called to compete for the finite resource of women, and to split the women among themselves, deciding which women are and are not permissible to possess by which kinds of men. And all those deemed women are called to negotiate their commodity. If a woman is capable of producing a citizen because she can bear children, and she is of the right nation and ethnicity and race, and has no defect she can pass down, she may be a wife. On that note arises a question. What if one fails to meet their birth-destined standard of labor? What if they cannot perform their proper gender adequately? Well, a wife that fails to sufficiently provide for her man is, of course, lazy. And when women utterly refuse to behave as women should, bitches be.
The Just as Disabled rights in the UK workforce establish accommodations so that people who are under the social model of disability, who would be unable to be productive, should be allowed accommodations so that they can continue the capitalistic regime, so they can be productive members of society. The accommodations are in exchange for productivity. And nothing highlights this more than the UK government's decision to cut disability benefits for those who are long-term sick, long-term off work, or permanently off work, to have to prove that they are completely and definitely worthy of help and support, that they are not simply lazy, that they are not simply unproductive members of society, choosing to go against the regime, that they must justify the reason why they must be given help, that this applies to transition too, because the female's role in a capitalistic world is to produce the labor force. And so the idea, just as hysteria was used against the woman who complained about her place in society, that the idea of the trans man, that the idea of transition in general works in the same category. That the trans man who forgoes his reproducibility, his reproductive ability, his reproductive duty, must be mad in some way. Because those that aren't productive to society, those that risk contaminating the rest of society, those must be isolated, those must be kept out. Just as trans people were put into asylums. That the pathologization of trans people is under the condition that they at least attempt to be normal. They attempt to embody the roles that capitalistic society has set out for them. And so we get into one of the worst aspects of this ruling. Early on in the ruling, in the judgment, they established that the Equalities Act definition of sex must have been in line with the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, under which transsexual people were not recognized. So therefore, the definition of sex under the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act could not and would not have been intended to include transgender people, as no future legislation attempted to reform that act. The definition of sex in law continues that 1975 understanding of what sex is. At one point, they refused to elaborate to define biological sex, but later on in the judgments, they define the female sex as a shared biology of women and girls, as a capacity to give birth, as a capacity to reproduce, as a capacity to get pregnant. And so they legalized the TERF opinion that they have shared disadvantages on the basis of biology, not on the basis of patriarchy. And so they enshrined in law the TERF definition of what a woman is. The one that says that you are just a broodmare, that your oppression is based off of your biological reality as your ability to reproduce the labor force. That is your fate. And all I can say is I'm sorry. Like, are you okay with this? You can't be okay with this. Like identity politics gets a bad rap, but you cannot, I mean, are you okay with your identity only being affirmed, being enshrined in law as your ability to give birth? Is that okay to you? Because I can fucking explain to you why it shouldn't be.
Indian society's reduction of women to the role of broodmare, mere vessels to further a man's line, ensures that women who cannot fulfill this role face harsh stigma and censor. Barren women are reduced almost to the state of untouchables, considered to be carrying bad energy that could infect and bring misfortune upon those they interact with. Their treatment calls to mind the reality of societies with intense patriarchal contradictions and demonstrates how women are accorded no humanity, no internality, and no autonomy outside of their reproductive roles. Old women do not have babies. They have outlived their husbands. There is no reason to value them. They live in poverty because the society that has no use for them has sentenced them to death.
The judgment continues to rule that biological sex is defined at birth. So it creates this de facto environment in which the doctors 10-second, if we're being generous, examination of your genitals at birth determine your biological, legal, and social reality for the rest of your life. Is that okay to you? I mean, I know I'm talking to the witchcraft community and the pagan community where we have the defined feminine, we have the mother, maiden, crone. But like, really, are you okay with this? It gets worse than that, though. Because of their interpretation that the Equalities Act must have been based off of biological sex at birth, that the gender recognition certificate does nothing in regard to change that. We lost women's rights in this judgment.
Hi, next day Sleepy Raven again. One thing we did forget to mention in this bit is that the Supreme Court ruling also had the audacity to try and legally define what a lesbian is, saying that a lesbian can only be a cis woman who is sexually oriented towards other cis women. Not only is this completely absurd that they think that they have the right to do this, this raises serious questions about the legal protections that cis lesbians and trans lesbians alike both have in cases of things like unfair dismissal tribunals and even things like hate crimes. I mean, I know that they never actually apply hate crime charges to anyone, but in a relationship where you have a cis lesbian and a trans lesbian together, it could potentially be argued that that is no longer a same-sex couple and so wouldn't be protected under the Equality Act. Also raises incredible questions about the years between 2004, when the Gender Recognition Act was put in place, and 2013 with the Same-Sex Marriage Act, as one of the main purposes of gender recognition certificates was to allow transgendered women to get married to members of the opposite sex. So a trans woman could get married to a cis man, and a trans man could get married to a cis woman. Has this now retroactively annulled those marriage certificates in the same way that Corbett versus Corbett annulled the marriage certificate of April Ashley and Arthur Corbett? We'll see.
I hate when trans rights are framed as an attack on women's rights, and so because they're attacks on women's rights, that's why they should be valued. But this is it's the same fight. This is a shared fight. This is our fucking fight. This is what feminism is all about, is fighting against this fucking shit. I don't argue this because, oh, it's affecting cis women and so therefore it's more valuable. I argue this because it's affecting fucking women, of which I am one. Regardless of how I present myself, regardless of my pronouns, while there continues to be no other real categorization through which we can fall into, because the sex binary still exists. If I am not a man, then I am a woman, and fucking Christ, am I not a man.
The charlatans with far too much ink to spill have said enough. Now is the time for the transsexual, the third-sexed woman, the third-world lesbian, and all those who have been reduced to rhetorical props to speak, to scream, to roar, to raise their voices in a cacophony. Now is the time for the damned to have their due, for the wails of the forgotten to echo above the civil silence and din. Now is the time for all those whose struggles have been erased, co-opted, recuperated, disrupted, and sanctified to make themselves known. Now we will speak, and you will, for the first time, listen.
Let's get into a few areas where this ruling is just fucking bizarre. I mean, first of all, in opening up the realms of what is a single-sex space, whereby you may de facto exclude trans women. Not that you have to, but you can. De facto you can. There's no protection to stop you from excluding trans women. Then Baroness Faulkner comes out and says that under the Equalities and Human Rights Commission guidance, if you are not excluding trans women on the basis of their sex, then you cease to have a legitimate aim in creating a single-sex space. So let's find an example of this. Perhaps maybe a female-only gym. A gym where women want to come to work out and exercise without risk of being mansplained to, without risk of being ogled, without risk of being sexually harassed in this space. If the Equalities and Human Rights Commission goes forward with what it intends to do, they can argue that by including trans women within that space, it is no longer a single-sex space. It is now a mixed-sex space, and therefore you have to allow cisgendered men to attend. You have to allow men into women's spaces now. If you want to include all women in your women's space, you have to include men in your all women's space. I know, but it gets worse though. I mean, let's fucking let's go capitalistic here. Let's stick to the capitalism because that's all that fucking matters to these people. They established in this ruling that in a gendered wage dispute, so on whether or not there is gender discrimination on the basis of wages paid to employees, that the comparator for a trans woman, as in a trans woman argues that she is being underpaid on the basis of her sex. The comparator for a trans woman is a cisgendered woman. So as long as she's earning the same or more as a cisgender woman, then she cannot claim unequal pay discrimination. But it goes in reverse. Now all a company has to do is hire a trans woman at the lowest rate of pay possible, which statistically we already are. And when a cisgender woman wants to complain about discriminatory pay, they can just say, well, we have this biological male who is on less than the cisgendered woman. And so therefore, on the grounds of sex, we aren't doing anything wrong. They're stripping away all of our rights. Do you understand it yet? Do you get it? It's all of us. If this continues into bodily autonomy, if this continues into stripping away trans people's rights to access to hormones and surgeries, they're going to do it to all of us. It sets the legal precedent that autonomy over one's body is something that can be stripped. Have you got painful periods and want an elective hysterectomy? Go fuck yourself. That's the situation that we're going to be in here.
What's the ultimate goal of that?
The ultimate goal, of course, I mean, just look at everything else. Like, as we're stripping away disability rights, as we are giving credence to the idea of population collapse, of the great replacement therapy, as we live in a society that has a shrinking population but refuses to allow immigration to replace the workforce, where do you think that workforce is going to come from instead? This isn't like fringe theory. This is just fucking history. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a hysterical tranny. Please, for the love of God, check every single one of the sources in the video description below. So much of this work has gone so unappreciated over the years and has finally been proven true and correct. And the thing that we should have all been fighting for all along, that human rights are a matter of autonomy. When we say trans rights are human rights, we mean that trans rights are your rights. It's your right to do what you want with your body. Your fertility, your gestational capacity are yours. They belong to you. It is your decision on what you want to do with them. Do not let these freaks, these fucks, these cunts take that away from you. And don't let them use us as that weapon against you. And until next time, let's hex the patriarchy, because Jesus fucking Christ is there need for it.